I am that is. My sword shall wield for me.
Hello, we are Bloobcast. I'm Rob.
I'm James.
And I'm Ewan. But the question is, why are we called Bloobcast?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep. Don't need digging or breaking.
So hello everyone. Today we are talking about Brian Jaques' Redwall. This is a story about anthropomorphic animals, particularly mice and rats, in a battle. It's a battle between good and evil. There is a continuous line of stories, novels, a cartoon show, a video game, a graphic novel, audiobooks, and everything.
There was a video game?
Yeah, there's a video game. I actually haven't played it. Redwall has a special place in my heart. I grew up with it as a kid. I used to watch it, the cartoon show, at my grandma's house. I've read the books. I've read the novel twice now. I've read the graphic novel, listened to the audiobook. I've probably experienced the same story in more than one medium, like more than any other medium than any other story. That's something I want to explore a bit later on, but it's a brilliant tale. It's fun. I think it's, even though it's a children's book and a children's cartoon, I think adults can appreciate it as well. There's a lot of like deep themes, interesting characters. There's a goofy villain as well.
In case you were wondering, guys, this was James's pick for this month. Just in case anyone out there was wondering. No, it's James. You clearly like this series.
Well, yes.
I mean, wow, that's a lot to.
I love it. I've loved Redwall even before Discworld. Before another fantasy thing I'm not going to mention, Lord of the Rings, just everything else. I was exposed to Redwall. I think it's really been my gateway into the fantasy genre, which is why, understandably, I know obviously times have changed and our tastes of fantasy have also changed, and it is a children's book as well, so it's absolutely fine if people want to see it as just that. But for me, it was the starting ground for me into getting into the world of fantasy and just understanding, magic and Arthurian legends and stuff like that. So I think it was a nice thing for me to get into, for sure. But yes, no, you're absolutely right, Ewan. I love the hell out of it. So.
It's definitely kids' introduction to the hero of 1,000 Faces, kind of, that kind of protagonist, hero's journey stuff.
Yeah. I actually got that in my notes about like Matthias, who's the main character, undergoes he does go the archetypical hero journey. He starts as like a clumsy young mouse with a wish for adventure. Wants to live up to this legend called Martin the Warrior, who's like this big mythical figure who's like a mighty warrior, as you can tell by his name. And then by the end, he's basically ends up becoming Martin's successor through like some prophecy. And it's great to see him progress throughout the story.
For sure. I'm actually really glad you mentioned that. I was going to mention it a bit later, but because you mentioned it now, I think it's probably a perfect time for me to talk about it. Is that I do think there's in many ways the journey of Matthias mirrors like the Homeric journey. Traveling away and then traveling back to defeat the invaders, as it were, of their home as a transformed hero that's managed to finally fulfill their own destiny. But also I think there's traces of other things. Now, Brian Jacques is a very smart guy, or he was. Yeah, unfortunately he did pass away. He sadly passed away many years ago now, actually. But if you look up his life, he's a very interesting man. He lived in Liverpool. He was a milkman. Apparently he was a policeman as well.
Brian did every job under the sun.
I was a policeman, I was a docker, I was, long-distance lorry driver. Been round the block 10 times, Simon, anything to make a crust.
He didn't really go to university or anything like that. He's not like Tolkien or anyone else that kind of like, went around studying mythologies or anything like that. He was just a normal guy, really, that just liked telling stories.
Even though he'd inherited a love of books from his father, at age 15, he turned his back on academia, left school, and joined the Merchant Navy to set sail from the mouth of the Mersey to see the world.
But he loved the King Arthur story, and he was very well read as well. Like, he's talked about Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and he's mentioned King Arthur, the works of Dickens and stuff like that. It does show as well when you read his book. I'll get into his prose a bit later, but one of the things I did notice is that you can catch on to other myths that you think might have inspired Redwall. I feel like there's bits of the Beowulf myth. Almost, I feel like Matthias fights different monsters and stuff like that, and goes through these different cycles.
Oh, yeah.
Oh yeah, he fights a giant snake, which was awesome.
He fights a giant snake. That's his Grendel, as it were, and he progresses. I think it's the journey of the I don't know if there's a word for it, the Beowulfian hero or the Anglo-Saxon hero, but
like a Nordic hero.
Yeah, absolutely. There's bits of that, bits of King Arthur. I love that. Like I say, it's one of the earliest exposures to myth for me.
And one thing I did like with Matthias is that when Cluny, who's the bad guy, came back, Matthias, he wanted to fight, and then even though the head of the priests was like, no, we don't fight. Matthias was like, no, we need to fight because otherwise they're gonna walk all over us.
We'll be ready. We'll stand firm. We'll stand together. We'll fight him!
I will hear no talk of fighting. The council will withdraw and consider what to do. The rest of you, go back to bed.
Interestingly enough, that's different in the book and the graphic novel. Matthias says instead is like, we will be ready or whatever, and then the priest was actually like, oh no, he's right, we will be ready. Whereas in the animation, he's a bit like, no, Matthias, I don't know, it's interesting, the characterizations, there is a difference.
Yeah, because for context, I didn't read the novel. I read the graphic novel and I watched the first season of the cartoon. So I kind of maybe missed out on some of the stuff that was in the book, but I have experienced the story in two different forms, as it were.
But Rob, you don't need to worry too much because I've read both the novel and audiobook and the graphic novel, and the graphic novel does take it's basically they've taken all of the dialogue from the novel and left out all the kind of descriptive stuff. It is basically the same story. It's a more accurate adaptation than the animated series for sure.
Full disclosure, I read the first book and I watched the entire cartoon this morning. Well, the first season of the cartoon, because as you mentioned, there's a lot more books, and presumably the next few seasons will cover those books later. But yes, I have not read any of those books. I have literally just read the first book. I should stress, because I'm conscious that there probably will be Redwall fans here who will expect, James, you're going to have to do the heavy lifting on any other stuff because I don't know any of that.
I should have mentioned before, we are focusing primarily on the first story, the first book that was ever written by Brian Jaques. It is just simply called Redwall. It's the story of Matthias the Mouse taking on Cluny the Scourge. It is series 1 of the animated show, and there's only one graphic novel for that. There's no other graphic novel for Redwall other than the first book. So we are focusing primarily on that story. We're not focusing on the Martin the Warrior prequel. We're not focusing on Matameo. We're not focusing on Mossflower. There's a whole bunch. There's a whole mythology.
Sure.
We're focusing on the first one. Maybe we'll come back to this, but I don't want to put too much pressure on these guys. The books, despite them being children's books, they are quite big as well, actually.
It was surprisingly detailed. Yeah, there's a lot there's a lot of little touches that, the first book is very, it goes into a lot of, various plot moments. It's not just Cluny invades the Abbey and Matthias goes on a little adventure. It's more Matthias goes on several adventures and Cluny tries to invade the Abbey multiple times. It's this constant kind of looping back and forth between each character is trying to get ahead of the other, which is interesting.
I guess it's like The Hobbit in that respect, because you think of it as a children's book, but it is actually quite in depth.
My name is Bilbo Baggins.
Bagginses. What is Bagginses, precious?
So, young children, you could read it to younger children, but it might go over their heads a little bit.
I think we have jumped in a bit. Do we want to talk about how we discovered Redwall as well?
Yeah, go for it. Because you're the Redwall guy, you brought this to us. I'd say you go first.
Lovely, thank you. Right, so for me, I'm going to just put it out there. I'm a person that loves entertainment and media to this day that involves anthropomorphic animals. So I like Animals of Farthing Wood. As a kid I loved Animals of Farthing Wood. I liked Stuart Little, The Wind in the Willows. Essentially this is Wind in the Willows with swords. I'll explore that a bit later on.
You've never ridden a motorcycle.
Instinct! There!
Just watch this!
But I was first exposed to Redwall when I went to my local library. I went to the local library and we had VHS tapes. They were giving out VHS tapes, computer games and stuff like that you could borrow. So we borrowed the Redwall movie, and the Redwall movie is not actually a movie. It's actually just the first lot of episodes molded together into one extensive animation on VHS. So I watched that at my grandma's house after borrowing the video, and so then I got exposed to the whole story about Cluny the Scourge and stuff like that, Asmodeus, and because at this point I was probably quite a young kid, all I had been watching really was like, things that are quite light-hearted and stuff like that. It was very rare, apart from maybe Animals of Farthing's Wood, it was very rare to have something that had action or had, actual real death and, sort of like some shocking moments and an epic story and stuff like that takes itself quite seriously. It was kind of an early example of that for me, so it really took me away as a kid. Like, it blew my mind a little bit to get immersed into this sort of world that was a bit different. And I love the Arthurian nature of it all and stuff like that. I love the opening and stuff, so I got really sucked into it. And my brother also loved it as well. He read the book before me. He read a lot more of the books, actually. And then when I became more of a teenager and I was getting into like the fantasy genre a bit more, this is an interesting thing about me, but in terms of literature, I didn't really get into the fantasy genre until a bit later on. So I kind of read Redwall and The Hobbit and, and Lord of the Rings and stuff like that as a teenager, along with Lev Grossman's Magicians and the works of Neil Gaiman's Terry Pratchett. So that's when I kind of got into the more descriptive side. And I realised Brian Jaques, actually, he's quite a good writer. And it's darker than the TV show, you realise. There's the violence is a lot more detailed.
I got that from the graphic novel, because going from the graphic novel to the cartoon was like a massive shock to the system for me.
It's very gory in places. They go into quite graphic detail.
I'm just going to quickly say, there are two characters. Should we jump? I'm just going to put a spoiler warning here. I think I'm going to spoil this story. So if you don't want to spoil it for Redwall, please watch the first series of the show or read the book or read the graphic novel first. But there are two characters. There are foxes called...
The bad guys lose. I think it's okay.
Yeah, but...
it's that kind of story.
Chicken Hound and Sealer, their death is really, in the books and the graphic novel specifically, is really graphic and disturbing.
Yeah. They go into quite detailed stuff about how they're killed, yeah.
Yeah, they changed it in the cartoon show, and Sealer dies off screen.
If I were you, I'd run.
Chicken Hound escapes only to be eaten by Asmodeus. Still a bit disturbing.
Is somebody there?
Asmodeus. Come with me, young foxy. I will show you eternity.
But again off screen, you don't see Asmodeus eat. So we should mention Asmodeus is a snake. That they run into. Yeah, and that's he's always quite sinister because he comes in and out. Whenever there's a character like running around the woods on their own, you know at that point, oh, okay, they're about to get turned into snake food,
But in the book, before this happens, so he still gets eaten by the snake, but in the book, they are both speared repeatedly and thrown into a ditch together, and it's described in detail how Chicken Hound survives this, and is essentially thrown next to his own dead mother, barely alive, before being devoured by a snake. And he doesn't... and rein that as an adult...
Pretty horrific.
Yeah, even as an adult, I just thought...
Porridge!
There is some quite graphic moments like that where you are like taken aback because they are ostensibly children's books. But then you've got to remember that when I was growing up, I didn't read Redwall, but I did read a lot of, I absolutely adored Greek mythology, and I was fascinated by Greek and Roman history but Greek mythology. Oh my god! Like I can grab my Greek. I've literally got my Tales of the Greek Heroes by Roger Green, actually right across from me. I can see it, and I can tell you now, like the violence in those stories, and we just give them to children to read, and they'll tell stories about people getting decapitated and people being turned to stone and being eaten alive by monsters. You know, we love it. We love giving them to children, and children love reading them.
And that ties it, because we've done a couple of episodes before on like children's media, like even like when we talk about Beast Wars, like we were all like, remember James being absolutely shocked about what happened to Dinobot when he died in like a children's show.
Tell my tale to those who ask. Tell it truly, the ill deeds, along with the good, and let me be judged accordingly. The rest is silence.
That was upsetting, that wasn't it?
Yeah. Yeah,
Or
there's a lot of
what was the character called again? Is it Prototype or the weird alien one that appears? Do you know what I'm talking about?
Was that? Transmutate.
Transmutate.
Friend. Good. Friend. Dark.
That was horrible.
And also, of course, all the stuff in Batman the Animated Series, which he also talks about, like the whole Clayface episode where he gets drowned in clay and turned into a clay monster.
They wanted more of this stuff? Then let's give it to them.
Oh, not that way. Please.
Let's give him all he'll ever need.
Yeah. I watched a lot of these cartoons at my grandma's house, including things like Watership Down as well. I don't know what was going on during that time, but Animals of Farming Wood, Redwall, Watership Down, all these things with anthropomorphic animals were so bloodthirsty, and considering the fact that this is probably during a time when people were getting funny about violence and stuff like that.
Oh, we'll get into that next episode, probably.
Yeah, but
anyway,
anyway, but just to finish up my story, I was also exposed to nothing called Watership Down, which is just completely bloodthirsty. It was basically like Game of Thrones with talking animals, but I think there's a limit into which you can make something violent and it's exciting, and also violent to the point where it's a bit horrible. In Animals and Farming Wood, families are ripped apart and die really slowly on screen.
Oh yeah, I've heard about this.
It's the Game of Thrones of animals, basically. It was so bad at one point, my grandma saw both myself and my brother watching it, and she went, "Turn that off, this is terrible." So there you go.
Yeah, I suppose the argument, though, is with media about animals is that it's preparing children for the fact that nature is incredibly violent, and there is a lot of, like, extreme brutality that, you know, literally, if you're just watching something in a garden and you see, like, a fly get caught on a spider's web, it is horrific, you know, and that's just something a child will see no matter what. Like, you can't tear them away from that. They're gonna see stuff like that, and I think that fiction like this, showing cute little rabbits like in Watership Down, seeing them getting horribly mutilated by each other a lot of the time, it's like, yeah, that's what animals do to each other a lot of the time, because they're fighting over territory, and you know, and that's what this is about.
Redwall, I would say, I think is a perfect balance of that. It doesn't go too far, but it does do what you would suggest, which is show that, you know, nature can be a violent and vicious thing. In some of those shows, like Animals of Farming Wood, it can go too far. So I think Redwall, you know, keeps it subtle enough that it's enjoyable.
For me, like, I had some exposure to Redwall beforehand, but that was only that I knew it existed. I think, one of my siblings had the books, but I never read them because, I was a teenager at the time. It's probably 13, 14 maybe, and I assumed that these were like kids' books. I was too old for them and just never gave them much thought beyond that. Then years later, James told us all about the series, and we prepared to do it for this episode. But before we did, before that, this is like October last year, I ended up getting into David Peterson's comic book series Mouse Guard, which is a similar kind of fantasy series about mice with swords. So my perspective's interesting, as I discovered the Mouse Guard first, and then got into Redwall through doing the podcast. So interesting mix of opinions here. I'll try not to bring up Mouse Guard too much, because we might do an episode on it. But one comparison I thought with the two series and how they're a bit different is, with Redwall, they're animals with kind of more human characteristics. So they got arms and legs and things like that. They walk like humans, talk like I guess to do Mouse Guard, but Mouse Guard they're like a proportioned like actual mice, so they've still got like the stubby little arms and things like that.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Mouse Guard, because Redwall, even though we were talking about this earlier, because we were trying to find GIFs for Redwall in our Discord chat, and we realised there wasn't that many. But the thing is, Redwall is not that obscure. It has had an impact on the fantasy genre. Christopher Paolini, who wrote the Aragon series, has said that it's an influence. And obviously, the guy, what's the writer's name for Mouse Guard again, Rob? Because he mentioned
David Peterson. Yeah, he said he found. I think he said he came up with the idea, and then someone told him about Redwall, and he was like, he kind of tried to not copy Redwall, but just do his own take on a similar kind of format.
Yeah, so people have been influenced by Brian Jaques.
I definitely saw the books like advertised, in bookshops and stuff, because I used to go to bookshops a lot, just as a kid, just looking around, and I'd always see these books, but I never got them, and I never bought them, I never read them. I was always aware of them, and I was aware that there was a cartoon series as well. There must have been some advertising or something for Redwall, but I was never exposed to the series until now, really. Yeah, just the image of you'd always see these kind of images of mice in armor, or, mice in kind of fantasy gear fighting it out, or traveling. And, I don't know why I never picked them up. I think I was either interested in other series, because I read the Edge Chronicles a lot when I was growing up, and series like that, and I read Lord of the Rings when I was quite young. So I think that probably didn't help, because I think after you've read Lord of the Rings, it's kind of hard not to see Lord of the Rings in every other fantasy story, because obviously it's such an influential book and series in its own right. And yeah, like I said, I was interested in mythology, so I was always kind of reading a lot of that. Yeah, so I never really got into Redwall until, James suggested we check it out for this podcast. Yeah, no, I've got a lot of thoughts on it. One thing I did want to say with Redwall, I think what's great about it as a children's series is that it kind of comes from a childish imagination. I mentioned about how nature is so violent. If you're looking at animals just in your garden or in the park or wherever it is you see nature happening, and the amount of times you see like kind of not necessarily fighting, but just, there's always these kind of interactions, and you are kind of, your brain does kind of think to yourself, oh, what are they thinking? What's going on in these animals' minds? And then, and then you start to think, oh, what if the mice are having a war with the rats or with the sparrows, or, have all of these different kind of, it comes from a very kind of childish imagination, I thought, which is kind of appreciated. It's very sweet, this idea of like, oh, a mouse in armor fight, it's almost like the Nutcracker almost, because that has like the rat king. And
you mentioned Lord of the Rings, and you say when you sort of read Lord of the Rings, it's a bit hard to kind of get into other fantasy things because you see a lot of Lord of the Rings in them, but Redwall, I don't think there is that much Lord of the Rings. I see more of T.H. White's, Once and Future King, and myths and stuff like that, the Arthurian legend. I think it's more fantasy of that caliber.
Yeah, it's more kind of like Celtic kind of medieval stuff rather than like the outright high fantasy of Lord of the Rings.
I'm not even sure if Brian Jaques was a Tolkien fan, actually, now I think about it. I don't know if he's mentioned it. He might have been. He might have been, but I'm not
maybe
sure.
Not, maybe. Well, did you see any Star Wars in this? Because I saw a lot of Star Wars.
Your powers are weak, old man. You can't win, Darth.
When I was reading this, because again, it was the hero's journey. Clooney's a lot like, kind of Darth Vader kind of character.
He's got that kind of look to him, yeah.
I think, but my big tell for that was Star Wars is quite novel for the way that it jumps between Luke's story, but then it also cuts to like, you know, the Imperial officers and Darth Vader having a meeting. It's the jump between the heroes and the villains' stories. And of course, one thing I noticed right off the bat in the book was that we have Matthias' story, but then suddenly the next chapter is Cluny's story and Cluny's perspective as the villain. And the story jumps back and forth. Each chapter will go from Matthias or the heroes or whoever heroic character and what they're doing. It'll then suddenly jump to Cluny's story or in some cases Seela and Chicken Hound. But mainly, you know, it was this jump between heroes and villains stories, which I thought that seemed very Star Wars-y to me, because you had that same kind of structure in the storytelling, at least of the first film, and in this case the first book. I don't know if that's how Jaques continues to do it in the later stories, but
because that's the thing with Star Wars is, like, at the time, I think part of why it caught on was it because it was a melting pot of all these different influences, like Kurosawa and of course like the Joseph Campbell, and the big one being Flash Gordon. So it's like a melting pot of like everything, even that touches of Wizard of Oz here and there.
I think, I think one of the things that we should mention is that I absolutely love how well written the book is, even for a children's book. Okay, so there's, with writing and stuff like that, there are different rules and stuff that you can follow or not follow. It's up to you and stuff like that. I don't think there's necessarily a right or wrong way to write a book. There are different styles you can follow. But Brian Jaques' style is very much a paint a picture with your words sort of style. He will describe everything from the scents, from the the visuals, the temperature, the texture of the world, and you do get immersed into it. Unfortunately, the graphic novel doesn't have that, and neither does the cartoon series.
Yeah, I was thinking I missed out on that through just reading the graphic novel, but I read that just because I'm a very slow reader and thought the graphic novel would be more digestible.
That's fine. I mean, the graphic novel is still a lovely story. I'll get into the graphic novel a bit more later on, because it does have its own perks to it that the novel doesn't have either. But I just love the way Brian Jaques does write. I do contrast him a lot with Sir Terry Pratchett, and I also love Sir Terry Pratchett.
You mentioned
I definitely get a kind of Pratchett-esque set of vibes from, I guess, the story, maybe?
Not necessarily. I think it's quite the opposite, actually, because with Pratchett, he doesn't. Okay, I think it's a compliment, but also a criticism from me in a way, because I do think Sir Terry Pratchett doesn't believe the readers are dumb. He will infer that the reader knows what he's talking about and stuff like that. He will write something and get the impression that the reader knows what's going on. Like, rather than writing the cat caught the mouse was between the paws of the cat as he enjoyed his delightful dinner or something like that. He'll write it in a way that like kind of indirectly infers that's happened. But sometimes, because there's a lot of chaos and stuff like in Discworld, and there's a lot of reality is always kind of falling apart and stuff like that, sometimes I get lost, and maybe that's down to me as a reader.
No, I think there is some level of leaving it too much to the imagination with Pratchett, because I always remember the artist who drew Rincewind and Two Flower in the original story. He literally gave Two Flower 4 eyes, because what Pratchett had meant was that Two Flower was wearing glasses and he was 4 eyes, kind of thing. But the artist literally interpreted it as 4 eyes, because Pratchett at no point in the story actually mentions him wearing glasses, or even describes them. He just says he has 4 eyes. So that's a little detail.
Because the other writer, like Tolkien, is he went into so much detail at least in the Lord of the Rings, about like everything going on, like we talk about the history of a field they're in and stuff like that.
I think Brian Jaques he's kind of in that sort of territory. He's not trying to focus on the wit, and he's not leaving the imagination entirely to the reader. I think he is painting the picture. I mean, it's good because, like, for a reader like me, you do understand how the characters look. You realise Cluny looks like this large rat from the sea that is like shadowy and almost demonic, and has a horse.
He's a pirate.
Yeah,
he has an eye patch, you know.
He does.
Or at least he's one-eyed in the book. I don't know if he had an eye patch, but he has an eye patch in the cartoon. Yeah, like they mentioned he's like a sea rat or something like that, and I immediately just imagined him as a pirate.
And you have his like first in command Shadow, who looks a bit like a. We're not sure if he's a rat or if he's a weasel or something like that.
Get me Shadow!
Where's that damn fourth Chaos Emerald?
Yeah, speaking of Cluny, that's something I kind of wanted to talk about. Maybe because I only watched the TV show and read the graphic novel, but I'm not sure what to think about him. Like, he has a cool design, but I never really got like the sense that he was like this great villain. Like, he was just like some bad guy who wanted to take over Redwall. Like, yeah, sometimes you can have a villain like that, and depending on how they're handled, like they can be engaging, but. Yeah, I just didn't really attach myself to him, if that makes sense.
Yeah, there's not much to him, I would say. And he's not a Zuko or anything like that.
Fair enough, but at the same time, I don't know. All right, how can I describe? So basically, it's like Skeletor, for instance.
What?
Like, he's not. I like kind of goofy. I like goofy villains and stuff like that, and I think it works. Like, I mean, fair enough. I do see what you're saying. I think you're making a very good point. He's not an in-depth villain, but equally, I do think that he's like got a lot of things that are a bit Shakespearean going on.
Oh yeah,
like, he's a bit like a Macbeth or a Hamlet. He's haunted by night terrors and the ghosts.
The biggest comparison there would be Richard III, who is also tormented by nightmares and of course is just completely evil in every regard. There's no kind of good side ever really given to Richard III by Shakespeare.
Yeah.
So I always got that vibe from him when he had his nightmares about his previous victims and all that sort of thing.
For sure.
That was definitely a Richard III moment.
But also to like, go on to the point where you say he's not that in depth and stuff like that. I don't think he needs to be, because there's an element, especially in the book, he is described as being like a folk legend, a warning used by mothers when youngsters were fractious and disobedient, just like a bogeyman.
So he's kind of a symbol of evil, basically.
Somewhat, but there's an element of mystery to him. He's a myth. Do you know what I mean? Like a myth to scare people, to give them nightmares. And Methuselah, in both the graphic novel and the book, he literally pores over the chronicles of Redwall, and he recalls to himself from memory that Cluny has caused disease, death, murdered piglets, burned down farmhouses, and there's chronicles providing evidence of these exploits. So there's this element of like, gosh, we don't know too much about him, but that increases the sort of nightmarish quality of him, I think.
Yeah, and it makes the kind of the defense of Redwall so dramatic and so kind of inspiring, because we've been given this idea that this guy is just this unstoppable force, and then suddenly he runs into the Redwall Abbey, and immediately he's just repelled. He can never break in, no matter what strategies he tries. They always come out with something to beat him, and so the idea is you kind of reading it and thinking, wow, these Redwallers are so, they have a lot of smarts to them, or they're, they always figure out what he's planning at the last second, kind of thing, which is fun.
So just going back as well to what I was saying about Skeletor and stuff. I mean, like, Aku is one of my favourite villains ever in Samurai Jack. I don't think he's that in depth, really, but I love him because he's a comedic villain. And look, Cluny Scourge is an absolute monster. He's literally a cross between the orc who screams "Meat's on the menu, boys" and Captain Blackbeard.
Looks like meat's back on the menu, boys.
In fact, weird enough, like the whole rat clan seems like a weird mix between pirate swashbucklers and Middle-earth orcs. I think he makes me laugh a little. He is a bit comical in a way. He makes these funny growls and stuff like, I'm Cluny the Scourge, I don't like porridge, I just like that kind of...
Yeah. Well, there is some implication that because of the way he fails to take Redwall, you could argue that a lot of the myth-making was actually just him spinning tales about himself, because he terrifies all of the other rats into believing everything he says and doing everything he says. So you could argue that they're just the ones spreading rumors about him, and really he's not actually all that.
He's more like the Hood from Thunderbirds.
Soon you will be under my influence. Even though you are far away, you cannot escape me. Kirano, Kirano.
His greatest opponent is Martin the Warrior, the legend of Martin the Warrior. So it's one legend against another. And when he realises his legend is not enough to defeat the morale of Redwall, he realises then, oh no, I don't have power here. I need to take that flag to ruin their hopes, to destroy the dream of Redwall and let the myth of Cluny strike fear into the hearts of all that opposes him. That's the vibe it was giving me. I like doing it.
To take things back a sec, one thing I wanted to discuss, because I was kind of taken aback a bit by the cartoon because of this, but with the way the Redwall world works, when I was reading it, I got the sense that it was kind of like Toy Story, in the sense that you had these kind of small woodland creatures being very much like kind of human-like in the way they act and the way that they have a monastery and armies and all of these things, but ultimately they're still within a human world that they just happen to be inhabiting. And there were things like the fact that Cluny's entire army is able to fit onto one horse-drawn cart, and the horse is, to them, massive. And I always imagined that the Redwall hall that they were in was actually just a small part of a real-life monastery that they'd taken over. And, things like it takes a lot of effort for them to climb up trees and things like that. And I wondered if that was what was going on here, because then when we got to the cartoon, everything's very downsized, and everything's kind of built for animals. You know what I mean?
You make a very good point, because this is actually something that has been debated by Redwall fans. And you're right to infer that from the novel, because I think that, if I remember correctly, because it was a few months ago I read the novel, there is an implication that this takes place in the human world, and there's a larger carriage or like an abandoned carriage that's human-sized or whatever at one point. So there is that implication. However, it's not great writing on Brian Jaques' part, but that's abandoned later on in the later novels, and it's kind of implied that they live in their own world, basically, that's not inhabited by
because
humans.
you mentioned that, and it made me think of how in Mouse Guard, that is very much, because it's a comic book, it can clearly show what the world is, and it's clearly like a human world where the mice and all the other animals have parts in it, so everything is like really small. Like they ride on like rabbits that they use as steeds, basically.
My other thought was, because because my mind was going, there are humans in this world, and it is basically just our world, but these animals just happen to be more intelligent, and they're clothed and use weapons and that sort of thing. But my other thought was, this is a horrifying world, because you have sentient creatures like the owl and the snake, Asmodeus, eating other sentient creatures. So it's basically just cannibalism to some extent, or at least some, it'd be like if we knew that pigs or chickens could talk, and we just went, yep, we're eating them anyway. I just thought that was interesting, how horrific that was.
One thing I wanted to mention, and it goes back to what I was saying about the comparisons between Pratchett and Jaques, and this is one against Jaques, is that with Pratchett, he writes characters that are full of potential of redemption. They might be born as a zombie, but they might end up becoming a good zombie, or like they'll be an orc, but rather than be a barbaric orc, they might be well read and whatever, or they might be a wizard, but they might be inept and then end up doing something else completely, sometimes at times heroic or whatever.
They're never fixed in their place.
Whereas
their characters are very fluid.
Redwall is the opposite of that to a fault. So the mice are the good guys, the rats and the weasels are the bad guys. The only kind of exception to that rule, I think, is Captain Snow, the owl you mentioned, and also the Squire Julian Gingerveer. I hope I said the name right.
Gingerveer,
So basically, those two have a long history. They have a quarrel, as it were. But Squire Julian basically becomes a vegetarian, or pescatarian. So there's
Are the fish sentient?
Again, That's a good question. I don't want to think.
Yeah.
Just something this like just eating these poor talking fish. Like, no, please.
Yeah.
That's a.
Because they even mention that bees apparently talk in this world. Like they mention that the
Oh no, not the bees!
Not the bees!
Oh, no, not the bees! Not the bees! Ah! Open my eyes!
Yeah, they're talking to the bees to argue with them, and I just thought, okay, so bees are apparently sentient enough that they chat to them.
Yeah.
So it is a world where the rules don't quite. Well, I don't know if they were thought out, at least for the first book. Maybe in the later ones they're a bit more clear-cut. They're just little things like that I was noticing.
Captain Snow, he does turn into the good guy in the end, even though he tries to eat Matthias earlier on.
Yeah, this is the thing. Like he's still apparently eaten countless mice and shrews, knowing full well that they are sentient, thinking, talking creatures, which I just thought was kind of, quite funny.
Oh, that just reminds me of that episode of Futurama where they get those like alien nugget things and they start selling them, and then Leela finds out they're actually sentient, and then she's like, "No, we can't eat them."
They taste so good.
They're tastier than an unguarded penguin nest. What do you call them?
We haven't thought of a name yet.
Well, they're tasty, right? Let's call them Tasticles.
No.
But go back to like this idea that characters can redeem themselves and stuff like that. This is funny. There's an episode of Blue Peter where Brian Jaques is answering questions from little children, and one of the children actually asks him about this, and it's a really good question that she asks, and it kind of stumbles him, I think, because like she literally just says like, "You're right about the mice being the good guys and the rats being the bad guys. Have you thought about writing a book where the rats can become good, or like the weasels can become good?" And then like Brian Jacques is like, "Well, the way I see it is, when you think of a rat, that's a bad guy, whereas the good guys are you guys and stuff like that." It's like, okay.
In your books, stoats and weasels are the bad guys. Could you write a book where they are good?
I'll try not to. Actually, you see what they call the characters are the goodies and the baddies, isn't there? There's no schizophrenic baddies and sympathetic goodies, and or the other way around.
Or bad.
That's right, yeah, the other way around. Anyhow, if you think of a rat, you can call somebody a dirty rat. Right away, you've identified the baddie. So, weasels, stoats, ferrets are vermin, and that sounds bad. And the good guys are you.
So she asked like this really intelligent question. I just thought,
Yeah, well, first off, like mice are vermin as well, so I don't really see his argument that like, oh, when you see a mouse they're good, and when you see a rat they're bad. No, if I see either of them in my house, I'm getting mouse traps. Like I don't want them near my
sister's
food.
got pet rats, and they are precious.
Yeah, and then we domesticate both, we keep them as pets. So it is a strange bit of logic there, because who's to decide what vermin are when all of these characters in some way or another are vermin? Like if you're a farmer and you see rabbits on your farm, you think, oh great, they're eating my crops,
or even badgers. Like
yeah.
I remember going to a scout camp once, and we were doing a night hike, and one of the leaders told us, "Don't step on farmland because a farmer might think you're a badger and shoot you."
Yeah.
Here's a bit of food for thought while we're on the subject of animals and stuff like that. There's not, in my opinion, I don't think there's a lot of modern fantasy involving like anthropomorphic animals. There was a time when you had quite a lot, like a few. I can name a lot of them that came around probably between like 3 decades or whatever. Like Duncton Wood, Redwall, His Dark Materials, Annals of Farming Wood, Watership Down, The Chronicles of Narnia, and by and large, I think a lot of this all stemmed from The Wind and the Willows, and maybe Winnie the Pooh.
Yeah.
But you don't.
Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah, I think that's a good example.
Closest thing I can think of that's kind of a bit more recent, although it's not fancy, it's more sci-fi, is they did this weird Looney Tunes show called Lunatics Unleashed, where it's like this
I love that.
more action-based sci-fi show with ancestors of the Looney Tunes characters.
In the year 2772, a meteor strikes the city planet of Acmetropolis, knocking it off its axis. This cosmic event releases supernatural forces, unleashing a new kind of hero, the Lunatics.
I've
never watched it, but it looks like why.
I watched that. I loved that as a kid. But obviously, we have a lot of animated media concerning talking animals, like Sonic the Hedgehog. I myself animate a talking animal cartoon called Ben Penguin, as you'll know. But I would like to see more high fantasy, epic stuff involving talking animals again. I mean, obviously we've got Mouse Guard and all that, but I feel like that genre has kind of died out a bit in recent times. I'm not really quite sure why, but I'd like to see more things like Redwall.
Now, the big question is, would you say that Redwall is fantasy? Because I know obviously it's fantasy in the sense that they're animals, but in terms of magic, there isn't really that much. Like there's a sense of destiny about Martin and Matthias, and of course the riddle of I am that is, and it turns out that so there's a bit of prophecy, but the sword itself isn't magical. That he eventually, the sword of Martin, like I know it's a kind of a sword in the stone situation, but it's not a magical sword. It's a normal sword from what we can tell. So I'm interested in that. That's a very good question. Yeah.
I think, first of all, we have to ask ourselves what we define as fantasy. Do we define fantasy based on the presence of magic? Because...
Well, I would say to an extent, yes, because otherwise this is a medieval story, you could just argue that it's just a medieval story that, it's animals.
But even like the Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones, even though there's magic in that world, a lot of it's not the focus, and there's more of it's focused on.
That's still fantasy though, because there are dragons and there is magic in that. Like quite.
Yeah, I'll still count that as fantasy.
But then I don't know. I think there is a certain. I think we do label things that like are characterized as myths and stuff like that as fantasy in this day and age. We wouldn't look at something that looks like a myth. Like I think even there was a modern novel about Greek myths and stuff like that has been labelled as fantasy, for instance.
Oh yeah, sure.
It's a more recent example, like The Northman, which came out a couple months ago. I really enjoyed it, but it isn't just a straight up like Norse film. Look, there was kind of some light fantasy in there, but I wouldn't say it's a full on fantasy film.
Yeah, the magic in that film was kind of implied to just be in their heads, like how they interpreted things in those days. It's a really cool film. If you haven't seen it, it's a cool film to see because it kind of tries to explore how a Dark Ages person would think, and so when they see something that's unexplainable, they think, oh, magic, which is cool. It was an interesting way of looking at it.
Another example of that is also Gormenghast, which is another widely regarded dark fantasy novel, and that doesn't really have any magic at all.
There's no magic in that. You're right. Yeah, so that's a kind of again, it's more just I'm kind of just fascinated by the kind of the world where obviously there is some magic because of course I am that is Matthias. There's a story of prophecy here and how Matthias is destined to become Martin's successor. But I like the idea that the magic is kind of so interwoven into the world. It's not something that you wave a magic wand and here's magic now. It's more just this kind of world of prophecy and maybe a hint of destiny as well and so it's interesting thinking about that. But I don't know, it was I was again just thinking about it. It's one of my many questions while I was reading the series.
No, one of the reasons why I really engaged it because it's kind of stumped me. I thought, hang, that's a very good question, to think about what we should think about that with like these sort of stories.
Because when I first read it, I was thinking it was a medieval themed story, but with animals, because it starts off in the monastery in the abbey and Matthias is a young monk or a young novice, and the whole story is kind of like almost like The Name of the Rose, this kind of story set in a monastery, and then these kind of evil influences come in from outside. But then of course, much like The Name of the Rose, there's a hint of magic in that as well, so that's a good book film as well if anyone wants a monk story.
One question I have, because I think I missed this out reading the book, but in the book is Cornflower given more of a character? Because I've got the sense from the graphic novel that because in the graphic novel
straight away both of us were like yes.
Because basically in the graphic novel she was barely in it. Then suddenly at the end, when the priest is dying, he says, "Cornflower, you must love and marry Matthias." And I'm like, that's kind of an arranged marriage. And I watched the cartoon and Cornflower was in it a lot, and I was like, oh, so why was she omitted from the graphic novel? So it's not an arranged marriage thing. She actually does have a bond with Matthias.
Even as a kid, I thought that was a bit weird.
No, in to be fair, in the book they do mention multiple times that Matthias and Cornflower are constantly eyeing each other up. Cornflower's Matthias's love interest, should mention. But yes, no, the cartoon definitely beefed up her role a lot, like to the point that she's joining in with when they're looking for the sword. She's heavily involved in
the cartoon. The
cartoon. Not.
I kind of disagree. I feel like in the book she's a bit more heroic and stuff like that, and whereas in the cartoon there's more weird, forced damsel in distress situation.
There was one episode where she's a damsel in distress, which doesn't happen.
More like
happen
5.
In the book.
Like
there was just
like,
the one.
first of all,
she gets caught in the wheel.
No, she gets caught in the wheel thing.
Yeah.
But then also there's the bit at the end where like Cluny that whole thing. That was meant to be the friar.
End,
That in the graphic novel in the book, that's the friar.
Yeah, but nobody cares about the friar. That was like the cook, wasn't it? Who gets kidnapped like at the very end of the book. Yeah, no one cares about him.
but in the book, the point I'm driving at is in the book she's more heroic, and she even tries. I think she attacks rats with fire at one point.
No,
like,
she throws.
Oh my god, the cornflower!
She throws the soup in there. Oh yeah, no, she accidentally sets the tower on fire. Yeah.
Yeah, she does. They do that, but they said, "Oh, even we can't sink to the level of fire." And the cornflower's like, "But they got rid of them, though."
Yeah, but that happens in the cartoon as well. That's cornflower in that.
No, in the cartoon, she pours porridge all over them.
If it's boiling hot porridge, like in Goldilocks and the Three Bears, when it's too hot, too cold, just right. Yeah, if you burn them with porridge, that would work.
That was an odd thing in the cartoon actually, because they did the tunnel story twice. Cluny tries to dig in with a tunnel, and they literally did that twice round. First they dumped hot porridge on them, but then later on they did the scalding hot water thing that they used in the previous in the book. So I thought that was strange.
That's one thing I wanted to say about the cartoon was that I noticed there's a lot of kind of filler here and there. There's some episodes that don't really feel like they contribute to the story, which is basically them padding it out so it fits a whole 13 episodes. So because I was like, so it's like this episode, like, a whole carnival comes to Redwall, and I'm like, this was not in the graphic novel. Was this in the book?
It was damage control.
I still think my favourite quote from Cluny was from the porridge situation. It goes like, "They defeated Cluny the Scourge with porridge." I just love that so much.
Yeah.
Porridge. They've defeated me with porridge. Heads will roll for this. Cheese thief!
That brings me joy.
That was a great moment. Yeah, I enjoyed that.
Yeah, I wasn't a fan of the voice acting so much in the cartoon. It was a bit off. I don't know.
That's the thing. I like it and hate it. So things like, I think Cluny's perfect. I personally think.
He was the best.
I like the moles.
Yeah.
I like the Somerset accents they got. They're like, "I knows where those potatoes be going."
About the same as me grandmum do find when she's rooting round olden time fortifications.
His grandmother found steps like these in the old ruins.
Kind of thing. Yeah, like.
I felt a little bit like with a lot of the accents, it felt like Canadians trying to do accents rather than actually casting people with a West Country accent or whatever. Well,
I guess because it was a Canadian cartoon. It was made by, I think, was it Nelvana? At least he's the first season done by Nelvana, who a big Canadian animation company who did the animated bit in the Star Wars Holiday Special. I think they did the droids and Ewoks cartoons as well.
The cartoon, the animation looks great.
What happened? I don't know. Well, somebody must know something.
I especially one thing that's not really animation, but I really loved it was the use of the tapestry. So one of the big things in the book and the cartoon is the tapestry, the history of Redwall. It's like the bio tapestry. It tells the whole history of the place. But they keep adding to it with each episode. So they show the episode's events as a kind of, a recap or during the credits, which I thought was really sweet. So if you've missed the previous episode, you can see, here's the episode where Matthias fights Asmodeus the snake and things like that, and I thought that was really sweet.
Yeah, and I love the Celtic themes music. Like I really helps sell the vibe. And
the music's great.
Yeah, and another thing I really liked about the cartoon is it doesn't really shy away from death. I mean, we did talk about how they changed the death in the thing. In some instances, they toned it down. But there was a lot of cartoons around that time that assumed that children couldn't cope with death, so they always shy away from it. Like, remember stuff like... Mainly a lot of anime that was brought over to Western audiences, like there's a bit in Dragon Ball Z where they blow up a plane and clearly kill the characters, but you can still hear Goku say, "Look, I can see the parachutes, they're okay." And most infamously, Yu-Gi-Oh! Infamously removed any instances of death. And instead, people were sent to the Shadow Realm.
It's a good point you make there, Rob, because even the animated show, it launches you into a tragic storyline with a child literally being born into a poor household with barely any food, and his whole family is being killed mercilessly. What makes it even worse is the older sister called Myrtle, who also dies.
She dies.
She dies. Before that happens, she goes on a journey that is shown to the viewer that actually, in a brief amount of time, makes you feel familiar to her as a character, you get connected to her and Matthias before she's inevitably killed. It's this kind of story, really. Basically, it just says, hey, lots of people are going to die, but we want to make sure we emotionally connect you with the characters first. Galzim's death before Asmodeus is just heartbreaking, It's just
because when I started watching the cartoon and I saw Matthias's backstory, I was like, I don't remember that in the graphic novel. Was that in the graphic novel?
No, that's not in the book. Yeah,
No.
that's just the show. They added that so that Matthias has a bit more of a background with Cluny, because it's Cluny who kills Matthias's family. Yeah. I guess to give kids a bit.
One character I want to highlight because I just loved her was Constance the Badger. As soon as I started reading the graphic novel, I was like, I love this character because she was very bad, not taking any crap from Cluny, and she was very aggressive. I was like, I love this character.
Do you know what's funny about Constance? In the animated series, she's shown as being like this anthropomorphic animal with clothes, carrying the carriage of both, basically carrying it like a human carrying a cart.
And it's in the graphic novel, she's actually pulling it like a horse.
Like a horse, yeah. That was very weird.
Yeah, I noticed that. Yeah, that was strange. Well, that's how I imagined it. When I read the book, I imagined her pulling it like a horse-drawn cart. Because again, I was thinking, she's normal badger size. The mice are tiny compared to her. So it made sense to me. And then, in the cartoon, she's walking on her hind legs, which is strange.
One thing just before we, just because we don't want to move away too quick. But Constance Badger does say in the book at one point, my badger senses told me right off that these were very bad at your rats. Does she have like a spider sense going on, do you reckon?
Another part in the cartoon that I thought was which threw me off. Forget his name, the rabbit.
Basil Staghair.
But yes, he said something like "kill the buckos," and I thought he was saying something else, which I'm not going to repeat because I'm trying to avoid swearing on the podcast. But I remember telling James this. And
to be fair, we've done a good job. We haven't sworn so far.
Yeah, but I think I remember telling James. I was like, he says kill the buckos. I thought he was saying something else, and then he's like, wait, he said kill?
Fire mice to the pond! Fill the buckets and form a chain!
He's not like that. And I said, no, this episode here, he says the word kill. And then James went back and looked and said, oh.
Basil Staghair, I imagined having a John Cleese voice, and I was very happy to see that the cartoon had the exact same thoughts. Kind of very, what good chums? Let's go on an adventure. What? Yeah. And I'm glad the book was exactly like that.
Yeah, he did have that kind of voice. Yeah, and another thing I've noticed was the character designs as well. They kind of remind me of Disney's Robin Hood, mainly the clothes they wear. But I got the vibe. I think it's mainly Constance again because she's wearing dressed as a nun. That I thought she looks like someone out of Disney's Robin Hood.
Yeah, I like Basil Staghair. He literally just he's got a lot of energy. He's a goofball who just potters around, not really knowing where he's going, and it's just like, "Hello, fine sir, to service." and he's always ready and prepared, and cracking jokes. So I've always, it was a bit random how he just appears just part way through the book, like, hello, I'm going to help you down fires, but at the same time, it's a welcome randomness.
Would you say that he is?
It was fun.
There's some implication in the book that he is actually insane, and that all of his talk about military service may not actually be true. I got the vibe,
He said he got like knighted a stag by 2 toes or something stupid like that.
Yes, yeah, he believes he loves stags. Yeah, some implication.
I don't think it's an implication. I think it's a fact that he's insane.
He actually, the good thing is he's on their side, sort of thing. But he is probably crazy, which is
another thing I wanted to quickly jump in about with Basil. Actually, in the cartoon, he's kind of a bit more. I don't want to say wicked. I wanted to use a swear word there, but basically, Basil Stegger at one point said to Matthias on a quest to Captain Snow, like, he might eat you, lol, tell you, old chap. And it's like, what?
He gave me this medal, bravery, honor, all that rot. Show him the medal, and he might listen to you. He may very well eat you, of course. Good luck, young'un.
What's wrong with you?
I noticed that there's a bit of a harder edge with the cartoon, because there's the bit when they actually, so Sealer the Fox and Chicken Hound, it turns out that they're like traitors. They're literally they're playing both sides so that they always turn out on top. And one of the things was in the book, they're double crossing Cluny, and Cluny eventually figures it out, and then murders Sealer, and Chicken Hound escapes, but then eventually dies himself. But anyway, in the cartoon, they figure out that Sealer's a traitor in Redwall, and then chuck her out to then be murdered by Cluny, which I thought was really brutal from the Redwall characters. They were like, yeah, we know he's gonna kill you, bye, and they just throw her out, and I was like, damn. So yeah, there's
these are the good guys.
And what about this traitor?
Oh dear. Yes, I suppose there must be some form of punishment, mustn't there?
Bury her up to her neck in red ants, then hang the wretch from the tower before you draw and quarter her? Or we could let her go.
Are you crazy?
Not really, but Cluny is. I'm sure he will know how to deal with her.
Now wait a minute. There's no need for that. I'm sure we can come to a better arrangement. I can be of great service. I'm a healer after all. I'm a healer!
Exactly, I did have that vibe, yeah.
There's a couple of things going back to points you guys made previously, going back to the medieval artwork at the beginning of each episode.
Yeah.
That intro and outro of the show kind of remind, obviously accentuates the medieval nature of the show, but it also kind of reminds me of Samurai Jack's intro and outros a little bit, but styled in a...
Yeah, it has the whole thing going through, telling this history of Jack fighting a coup, then getting sent to the future.
Well, both try to create a sense of myth, and I think that's a very good way to do it, really. But also going to the novel, there's also, I don't know if your version has this, Ewan, but there's medieval artwork on the top of each chapter. Which I think
I had the kind of wood chipping style.
I love those illustrations; they're really lovely. In fact, the cover artwork of the book is just top class.
Was the one you had? I had the one of Cluny on the horse with
No, I checked.
That's
so
great bit
I think
of artwork.
You've got the hardback, haven't you?
I've got the paperback.
Paperback. Okay,
I've got paperback. Yeah.
It looks a bit bigger than mine for whatever reason, but we had the same artwork, and I love that. They changed it in recent times to make it. I think there's a weird movement with publishers where they're trying to take children's literature and turn it into a YA. Like they're trying to basically promote it as such, like they're trying to present it to adults in a way, so they've made them with these weird mature covers where there's no cartoon mice or anything like that, and none of those epic illustrations. It's just like this sort of like bland golden symbol with a mouse on it. And the edge, funny enough,
it's like, now I was going to pick that up and then be like, what? Why is they mice? Why are they mice? This is not for me.
And the Edge Chronicles did something similar. Rather than having the lovely illustrations by Chris Riddell, they've kind of replaced it with this sort of CGI-looking kind of artwork, which is cool, but it's not. But it's not what the Edge Chronicles is. It's the
Okay, well, I'll need to. I'm not going to pass judgment. If they do look cool, then I'll.
They look cool,
But yeah, I know what you mean.
Yeah.
You lose that style, that 2D
It's
style.
like
which is so
replacing
great.
a Roald Dahl book, but not having any of the Quentin Blake illustrations, and I think that they're almost like a necessary part of it, if you know what I mean. But yeah.
Oh my god, 100%.
But it's like that.
Yeah.
Speaking of artwork, I want to talk about the artwork in the graphic novel. So it's got the same kind of rustic quality of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles comics, like the original ones from the 80s that we spoke about in an episode last year. I don't think it has quite as the same flair. And I think it gave the story a bit more of a mature and serious edge, which wasn't in the TV show as much, I think
there's a couple of things. So I was really interested. I thought it was the most different out of the... I mean, it still had the dialogue from the book, but stylistically, it's the most different out of all the visual stuff I've seen of Redwall so far. There's a weird...
Oh yeah, I remember you saying it's good. There's some Kurosawa
there's
in
an
there.
interesting
definitely.
chalk-like quality that reminds me of Kurosawa films, like Akira Kurosawa, and it's kind of dark. But one thing that was really interesting to me, and also ties into the Kurosawa observation, is that it does a better job of showing the scope of Cluny's army. There's like literally a panel with hundreds of rats, and it looks like something out of 300. Like literally in the cartoon, you don't see that scope. In the books, it does sort of highlight how big it is, but visually, you don't get this sense that this is a big, overpowering, intimidating army. Whereas the comic book does a perfect job of that. I think.
Because I got that from the comic. This is a big army invading Redwall. There's going to be a big battle. And then first episode of the cartoon, it's just Cluny and a handful of rats, and it's like, that's it.
Yeah. Another thing also that was interesting is Martin the Warrior. First of all, we haven't talked about Martin the Warrior, but basically Martin the Warrior is basically like the Rambo of the mouse world. He's just like this guy. What is he described as doing? I think he he fought foxes, vermin, and great wild cat single-pawed before turning to a life of humility or something like that. But in the cartoon, and I felt it was implied in the book that he was just a voice speaking to Matthias. It was the voice of the ghost of Martin the Warrior, but in the comic he actually appears as a ghost. Like you actually see the ghost of Martin the Warrior haunting.
Also, like the ghost of Obi-Wan Kenobi.
Exactly like that. Actually, yeah. So that was interesting. I thought there's little things. The artist seemed to be taking it into his own stride and doing his own thing with the story, which I really appreciated. Galzin's death in the comics, the Shrew, is grim as hell. Like in the cartoon, it's really emotional with sad music playing, but literally there are no words used in the panels where she's dying. And Logolog literally sees the corpse of Galzin, and it just slumps to the ground with their mouth open. It's kind of upsetting, actually.
We haven't talked about Asmodeus that much, or Asmodeus.
Yes.
I read it as Asmodeus, and I'm not going to change that, despite what the cartoon did. Smaug Smorg. Yeah.
It's like it's Smaug all over again.
Yes,
exactly. No, it's clearly Asmodeus. But yeah, so he's very cool. He's this kind of snake. Well, he's an adder, and he just pops in and out of the plot every now and then just to eat some unfortunate character who's in the forest. But then they actually need to track Asmodeus down later on to find the sword of Martin. And it's great. It's like it's kind of what I was saying about like taking the natural world and turning this kind of epic fight making an epic fight out of it. The idea of a mouse fighting a snake.
Asmodeus has come to kiss you goodbye.
It's such a great
idea. Because that was something. I'll cut it because that's something that drew me to Mouse Guard, because the very first issue of Mouse Guard starts with this big snake fight, and it ends with like the young impulsive mouse killing the snake by jumping into his mouth and bursting through the head, and I was like, yeah, I'm on board. Yeah, and
Vice does that as well, actually, sort of. Oh, he chops his head off, doesn't he?
Martin?
Strike, or Redwall.
at least in the grapnel, he beheads it. It doesn't jump into his mouth and burst through, which is what I liked in Mouse Guard.
Not sure if this is an accurate judgment, but Asmodeus kind of reminds me of Satan in Paradise Lost and Regained, doesn't it? And also, like, what? Why is that funny?
This is the second time you've compared a character to Satan in Paradise Lost. I
like Paradise Lost. It's fun.
I know, but you compared Shadow Weaver to Satan as well.
Yes, I have. But to be okay.
Sorry, continue.
No, you're right.
Next episode, Hexadecimal is like Satan in Paradise Lost.
Oh no. It's going to be my ongoing quote.
So Asmodeus is like Satan. I can see that.
And the Book of Genesis in the Bible, it's a snake who charms his victims and promises eternity, only to bring damnation and death to all those he crosses. And of course, Satan was a snake in the Christian stories. I'm not trying to force it in. Maybe I should just make it a mission for every episode. I've just got to mention the snake. Yeah.
Which one is Satan?
That's going to be my mission. I'm going to try and find that.
It's just such a bizarre comparison, But
it's right. God damn.
But when you say like anything, oh yeah, that character's like Satan, okay, they're the villain. I don't know.
It's like, of course, like Satan's an embodiment of evil.
Sauron is like Satan,
But he is like Satan.
I know, but like we all know that.
Anyway, but Brian Jacques. To be fair, Brian Jaques was himself religious and inspired by religion and Christianity. So. It's not all unfounded. But anyway.
But you could say, but what my point is, you could say that Cluny is like Satan, or the Shadow.
He is like Satan.
There's a lot of characters like.
He's
Satan.
likened to be fair, Cluny is likened to Satan explicitly in the book as well. It's not like a.
They mention they
is it
compare him
as
to devils, don't they?
On the nose as like Narnia, where it's like Aslan is Jesus. He gets crucified and he comes back.
If I ask very quickly, we'll do this real quick. Favorite characters in
I've already said, but Constance the Badger, because she's a badass and she's so cool. She doesn't take courage.
Yeah.
Nice, James.
Cluny the Scourge. I like him. I like villains that are goofy and they're quotable, and then I can make fun of them later on. I know. It's good to have in-depth villains and stuff like that, but sometimes it's like having a cheesy snack with entertainment. You just gotta have a silly little dumb villain that's really goofy and over the top sometimes. So I think it's a bit of fun. Yeah.
And for me, it's King Bull Sparrow, because he's a funny, weird sparrow.
It's good food for King Sparrow. King let a mouse worm live. One more son. Then mouse die!
And I liked him. And we haven't talked about him much, but yeah, he's the king of the sparrows. He's apparently crazy, and he makes up rules every 5 seconds. There's a lot going on in this book. I recommend it. It's a cute little
like
ride.
a Shakespearean king.
Yeah. Very kind of King Leontes from Winter's Tale or something like that. Yeah. Anyway, all right, we're good.
Cool. Do we want to talk about what we're going to be presenting next time, Rob?
I can do, yes. So I come from the Bloob, through systems, peoples, and cities to this place, Bloobcast. So that's probably going to go over most people's heads who are listening to this, but next time is our 25th episode, and because it's kind of a milestone, we're doing something a bit special, and we're discussing my all-time favourite TV show, Reboot, which is a show I have probably name-checked in a handful of episodes that we've done before. So I'm excited to finally get to discuss what makes this groundbreaking show so fantastic.
Yeah, I'm very excited. I've recently watched the whole thing myself, and it was a lot of fun. There's a lot to be said about it being one of the earliest revolutionary 3D animations of the time. So, yeah, I'm very excited for it.
And I like the villain.
Does it remind you of Satan?
So, yeah. Until next time, the Bloobcast bids you farewell.
Bye.
Bye.
Take care, everyone.
Thank you for listening to Bloobcast. We've been Rob, James and Ewan. You can find all of our episodes on bloobcast.com. We're also available on SoundCloud, Spotify and Apple Podcasts.
We also have a YouTube channel where we produce shorter episodes called Blooblets, where we discuss the latest news in popular culture. You can find us on social media with @BlueCastPod on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Please like, follow and subscribe so you can get the latest updates on new episodes.
We also have an email address, which is bloobcast@outlook.com. So if you have any feedback or want to suggest things for us to review in our future episodes, please feel free to drop us an email and you'll get a shout out on the next episode. Please also rate and review us on YouTube and Apple Podcasts. More engagement helps us a lot. And finally, please share the podcast amongst your friends and family. Help spread the word so that the Bloobcast empire can become strong and mighty.